It is March 16, 2018. I'm John DeLynn. We just did 2 hours with Greg in the morning, and this afternoon we're going to do 2 more hours with Greg. We are here to explore and celebrate and rage against this book, Leonard Arrington and the Writing of Mormon History. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to top David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism, but I don't know of a more significant book that sort of explains where we are today with so many of the issues in Mormonism, and including with the gays, the feminists, and the intellectuals, as our dear friend Elder Packer once said. Then this book, Leonard Arrington and the Writing of Mormon History. During the first 2 hours of this interview, we were able to talk with Greg about why he wrote the book a little bit. We'll talk more about that, but also most importantly, to get a history of how the church dealt with history prior to Leonard Arrington's administration. Then we talk about Leonard Arrington's ascent as church historian, where he served as official church historian for 10 years, basically from 1972 to 1982, and launched several important projects, several of which were scuttled, including a sesquicentennial multi-volume series of church history that never saw the light of day, and other projects. During these next couple hours, we are going to be talking about Leonard Arrington's faith. We're going to be talking about some specific, issues or events that happened during his administration. And we're going to be taking questions and comments from our live audience. So please like our Facebook page. Please share it. Please let all your friends and family know this interview is happening. We would love to have live questions and comments from our listening audience. So Greg, Dr. Greg, welcome back to Mormon Stories.
Thank you.
How was lunch?
Lunch is good. Should we give a shout out to Jimmy John's?
Yeah, this episode is brought to you by Jimmy John's. No, I'm just kidding. It is not brought to you by Jimmy John's, but we did have a good meal. All right, so we talked about Arrington and his administration ending. We're going to go back now and talk a little bit about his faith or lack of faith. But what I thought we might begin with is a really important book that you mentioned as being central to how he approached religion. And it was a book written in the early 20th century called Reason in Religion. And I maybe wonder whether that's a book that I could benefit from reading. But it's called The Life of Reason, Reason in Religion, 1905, by someone named Santayana. Can you tell us about that book and how it influenced Leonard Arrington?
I don't know whether it channeled him into an intellectual view of his religion or if it aided and abetted where he was naturally inclined to go. But certainly he approached religion during his entire life as more an intellectual exercise than an exercise of faith. That he struggled intellectually with some of the concepts within Mormonism. He felt that it was through his reasoning that he was confident in remaining in the church and in expressing his feelings that it was a true church. But going back to what we said at the outset of part one of this, since he grew up outside of Mormon country, he didn't have the exclusivist view of Mormonism that many of his co-religionists did. And I think that helped him, and it certainly informed his writings later on. So I think that this book really became an enabler of the way that he viewed religion and that wanted to view religion. It was interesting, his daughter, after his death, when she was talking to me about doing the biography, said that she had looked at the files that he kept of all of the high council talks that he had given. And she said there was not one that was on a spiritual topic. They were all history. And I think that goes hand in hand with this book, that he viewed his entire religious experience more along the lines of an adventure in the intellect rather than whatever faith meant to other people.
What was that? Was that book just basically saying that you don't have to take scriptures literally? Wasn't it sort
Yes.
of a book trying to handle the historical criticism that we talked about previously?
Yes, and look at the date. It's that decade, the first decade of the 20th century, when the critical examination of the Bible was really coming to the forefront in academe, and consequently when it became an existential threat to conservative religion.
Yeah. So, in this chapter called Walking a Spiritual Path, you share a chapter, I think a paragraph that I'm just going to read. He writes, Leonard's struggle to own his religion through intellectual wrestling, which began in his early teens, came of age on the college campus. For him, it was the only legitimate approach. Quote, those who have asserted that conversion comes only through the Spirit, it does not come through the mind, are wrong. Or at least my own conversion was not the product of action by the Spirit, unless it can be said that the Spirit works through the mind. At the core of his quest was honest doubt. Quote, I have heard many, many people say that they have always known that the church is true. At no time have they had any doubt that the gospel is true. While unquestionably this is the experience of most active Latter-day Saints, it was not mine. I've undergone the experience of deciding whether the church was true, whether Jesus was a great man or a son of God, whether Joseph Smith was an inspired religious teacher and prophet or leader who deluded people into following him. So it sounds like from a very early age, he was asking all the right questions.
He was, yes. And still he was comfortable with his boat in the stream at the same time that he was questioning. So he wasn't withdrawing from the culture, trying to do that assessment from the outside, and then making the decision to re-enter. He stayed within it, but he was constantly wrestling. And generally, I think that his wrestling was on a level mat as opposed to a level playing field. But on some issues that you'll get into later, he tilted the field in his favor and didn't apply the same rigor to his intellectual inquiry on some subjects that he did on others.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. There's a part in the book where he's talking to his son, and you get the sense that he feels overwhelmed because once he becomes church historian, he gets the sense that people are looking to him for something, and he doesn't quite know, what to give them. Can you tell that story and then how his son trained him a little bit?
Yeah, and a little bit of background on that. James, his oldest son, and I were in the Brazilian South Mission together. So when we did the formal interview, it was like a reunion for us, and he just launched right out without having to go through any superficialities to get there. But he described tutoring his father, because his father was constantly giving these fireside talks in church. And he said, James, I just don't feel I'm connecting with the people. And so James not only described, but he went through the physical motions of showing how he showed his father how to be a more effective public speaker. And he said, when you get to the end of your prepared remarks, he said, I want you to lean over the podium and take off your glasses, get close to the microphone, look at the people, and then tell them what they really want to hear, which is, I've looked at it all, you're fine, there's nothing in there that's going to blow you up. But it was really a very telling thing that Leonard realized what his inadequacies were in trying to convey any sense of spirituality. He was on the intellectual plane, and James was able to come in and give him some coaching, and he listened to it, and he became much more effective in connecting with his audience.
Yeah, but at the same time, that felt a little staged. Like,
sure it was.
What a really important question. Like, you've been church historian, you've seen all the, things in the vaults, where all the bodies are buried. And it was just, it was a little bit weird to hear that his son was coaching him on how to, and his son was an actor, right? To take off his glasses just right and lean in just right. And basically he was coached to say, I've never found any problems, never found anything that would question my faith. We all, as active believing Mormons, desperately want to hear that from our chief historians. So it came off as a tiny bit like uncomfortable or maybe staged for me.
But consider where Leonard was coming from. There was a large element of geek in Leonard.
Nerd, right?
Yes.
Yeah, he was a nerd.
And so to get him to move a little bit off center from that nerd epicenter so that he could connect better with his audience isn't being duplicitous. It's part of the art of communication. And I think that's where James added value to him. It didn't come naturally to him. He didn't know how to get there himself. And so he brought his son in, and his son closed the link.
Yeah. You do for some reason, talking about Book of Mormon historicity and Leonard Arrington was really important to you. And it was really important to me.
It was important to him.
So talk about that. Talk about his experience with considering the historicity of the Book of Mormon. And then you seem to kind of give an opinion about where he ended up with that question. And I want to dig into that. But talk about his journey with Book of Mormon historicity.
I think he just bought the traditional story of the Book of Mormon being a literal translation of an ancient record written in pre-Columbian America. And that's where the church was. You wouldn't read anything in church publications that would have indicated another possibility. Where he started to get knocked off his comfort zone was when a manuscript that B.H. Roberts had written in the 1920s suddenly surfaced. Now, what had happened was that a gentleman about whom we know almost nothing, who lived in Washington, D.C., had sent a letter to the church saying, I have some questions about your Book of Mormon, and here's what they are. Could you please answer these for me? Well, they handed them off to Roberts, and I suspect that Roberts, who already had written several books about the Book of Mormon, which took it at face value as a literal history, figured that he could probably deal with these pretty quickly and then get on with life. But he took them seriously, and as he started to drill down, he found out that he didn't have the answers. They were things, for instance, like linguistic issues. If the Native Americans came from Jerusalem and brought the brass plates of Laban with them and were still able to read those plates after the birth of Christ, so 600 plus years later, that would mean that their language capability had remained pretty much intact. And yet, if you move forward from that point to the 19th century, when Joseph Smith now is translated in the Book of Mormon, and you look around at the indigenous American tribes throughout the North and South American continents, you don't see any connections to Hebrew. So if the language had been preserved almost intact for at least 600 years, how could it disappear completely in less than 1,800 years? Those kinds of questions. And Roberts just found that he was unable to answer them successfully. He wrote a book-length manuscript. He made his report to the First Presidency and in essence said, if you've got better answers than mine, this would be a good time to talk about it. But they basically just put the whole thing on the shelf, and it stayed on the shelf. I don't know where the church's copy wound up, or if it did survive, but a copy of the manuscript came down through the Roberts family and was presented to the University of Utah at the time that Leonard was in the church historian's office. And the University of Utah published it. I think it was called Studies on the Book of Mormon. I remember it had a blue dust jacket. May have even been University of Illinois Press that published it. but the University of Utah was involved because Sterling McMurrin wrote an introduction to it, and Brigham Madsen had edited it. But here is a substantial book that is raising these issues about the Book of Mormon. Another thing that was part of Robert's study was a parallel that he had drawn up comparing the Book of Mormon to Ethan Smith's view of the Hebrews, which was originally published in 1823 and then published in a larger second edition in 1825, and had some very strong parallels to the plot of the Book of Mormon. Roberts noted those parallels but didn't attempt to explain them away. So when that manuscript came into Leonard's possession, and I think it came through, I think it was through Davis Bidden, it really shook him. And he didn't have the answers.
It says Davis Bidden had received 300-page manuscript from an anonymous source. So somebody had held on to this and then...
And it had come, at least one copy of the manuscript had come through the Roberts family.
Yeah.
So he was in turmoil over this because he didn't have any type of a fallback position. Was there some middle ground that would take into account the Roberts manuscript while still allowing him to preserve his traditional understanding of the Book of Mormon? To the rescue rode John Sorensen, an anthropologist at Brigham Young University, who simultaneously, without any knowledge of the Roberts manuscript, had been working on a book on the Book of Mormon and archaeology that basically attempted to overlay the Book of Mormon story on the known geography of the Americas.
And it was called An Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon.
Right.
Yeah. Which now has been pretty much discredited. True? As
even then...
It's kind of being junk science a little bit.
Even then, I remember we went on a weekend retreat with several couples, and Tony Hutchinson had just read that. And he said, well, here's what Sorensen is trying to say, that if you twist the compass 45 degrees, if you ignore this, if you allow for all of these other civilizations to have coexisted in greater numbers, and the Book of Mormon never mentions them, then you can make this thing fit. But we could even see at that point, hey, he's constructed a house of cards that collapses under its own weight. It doesn't fit, but he's trying to stretch it, compress it, twist it, and say, see, it fits. But it was good enough for Leonard. It bought him some time. And he felt that this was a victory, that the Book of Mormon as an ancient record had been vindicated, and now life could go on.
And I have to admit, I was a tiny bit posthumously, I guess, from his perspective, disappointed in Leonard that he just bought Sorensen's stuff hook, line, and sinker. Is that, should I feel bad admitting that?
No, you shouldn't, because I feel the same way about it. For all of his legitimate intellectual inquiry into other areas of Mormonism, I think he gave the Book of Mormon a pass.
And I guess implied in that response that's in the book is that you don't find much credibility to the Book of Mormon being historical. We've talked about that in your last interview.
Yeah. Now, once he thought Sorensen had answered the question for him, life was good for a while, and then other issues started to emerge, and then he had a second epiphany with the Blake Ostler article in Dialogue and felt, okay, now we're fine, because Ostler has taken some ancient elements and some modern elements and said, well, it's really a hybrid of the two. And that satisfied Leonard.
It says Ostler's creative co-participation theory of revelation, in which Smith was an active rather than passive instrument in producing the Book of Mormon, fit nicely a view of revelation, which his historian is almost forced to accept, which the historian... And this goes back to Spencer Fluman's comment in the meeting that I listened to. Spencer Fluman calls the Book of Mormon Joseph Smith's grandest revelation. In other words, it's not a translation.
Yes.
And that fits with what Ostler said, which is, okay, maybe Joseph's doing something with the plates, but he's infusing it with his own worldview, his own understanding of the world, his own theology, his own personality, basically making it no longer a translation.
Well, and to Ostler's defense, I think he gets part of it right, in the sense that Joseph Smith was an active participant in this process, but he was hyperactive in this process. And what Ostler leaves unexplained is, okay, so defend the ancient part of it. You have hypothesized that Joseph Smith was active on the other end, but what was the basis of getting him started? Was there an authentic artifact that he began with that was actually an ancient record? And the answer to that is we don't know, but we do for the Book of Abraham. And I think people, if they really look at the story of the Book of Abraham, at the relationship between the papyrus and the modern text, that you have right there the model of the Book of Mormon. We don't know what that trigger artifact would have been with the Book of Mormon because we don't have it. But what emerged in the Book of Abraham has no relationship to what's on the papyrus, and there is no need to say that what's in the Book of Mormon had an antecedent in some ancient artifact. It served as the catalyst for the workings of his prophetic mind. And I would agree with the statement that this is Joseph Smith's greatest revelation. I think that's what he always felt too, though it bothered him that people wanted to know the details, and he basically told them to take a hike, and he didn't want to talk about that. If you look at the subsequent church, the Book of Mormon remains this enigma, because in spite of all of the difficulties with trying to defend the ancientness of it, it has had a remarkable and ongoing role in people's faith journeys. For whatever inadequacies it has within its text, there's something else embodied in there that generations have found to be of great value. And I don't think you should minimize that.
And so this goes back to the way we began this episode, which is this idea that scriptures can be myth.
Absolutely.
They can be all myth and part history, or historically credible.
And if you look at the Bible, which is a conglomerate of many separate books from many different directions, you have all three of those possibilities. You have some that clearly are historical and have archaeological and other types of validation. You have some that clearly are mythical, and then you have others that are a hybrid.
And so it leaves us sort of wondering how deeply Leonard Arrington even allowed himself to consider the fundamental truth claims of the church. I mean, in a sense, we could ask, how could the brethren know all this history and still lead and believe? Well, if Leonard was even blocking himself from some of the deepest questions, I guess then we can understand how the brethren who didn't spend decades and decades studying this stuff would also never allow themselves to go there. Because aren't you basically saying Leonard wouldn't allow himself to go to the point of actually considering that the Book of Mormon isn't historical?
I think that was a line that he drew for himself, yes.
Yeah. And so do you, can we, are you saying the most credible position is that the Book of Mormon is myth? Like 100% myth?
That's where I am.
Okay, yeah.
Let me throw another comment in there. Several years ago, we had a professor from Wesley Seminary who is a specialist in Hebrew Bible teach our study group for a year. It was the same year that the gospel doctrine class was on the Old Testament. I gave her the course manual, and she rolled her eyes the next month when she reported back and didn't have very nice things to say about it. But in preparation for her teaching us about Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament, she read the Book of Mormon. And she said, this is authentic American scripture. She said, but what I read in it is that it is a book-length midrash on the King James Bible, which is pretty much where
Tell us what that word means again.
Midrash is It's really the process whereby a scholar interacts with a text, and that interaction results in a new text. So the Talmud is an example of midrash. So what Denise was saying was that Joseph Smith's encounter with the King James Bible led him to produce this book-length commentary on the King James Bible that's titled the Book of Mormon. And she said there's nothing embarrassing about that. And in fact, she views it as an authentic book of canon.
And for those who say, yeah, but Joseph was claiming that it was a translation from plates, so there's deception going on there. Your response is?
My response is there might be a difference between deception and inaccuracy, where the one is intentional misrepresentation and the other is, well, gee, that's what I thought it was. In the case of the Book of Abraham, he really did think that those papyri had been written by the hand of Father Abraham.
But he would have, we're guessing that he probably didn't have golden plates, so we don't, probably...
Well, we don't know, John, on that. The fact that he had an artifact with the Book of Abraham at least lends credibility to taking that model and backing it up 6 years. The model being artifact, prophet, new text. Well, in the Book of Mormon, we know we had prophet, new text. It's not difficult, at least, to posit that there's some kind of artifact back there. We don't know what it was. Was it an actual book of gold plates? Don't know. Because even the representations of the witnesses are not flawless. There are some historical inconsistencies with those. So I think we just have to leave that question unanswered. But we certainly don't have to leave unanswered the question, does the Book of Mormon have sufficient credibility as an ancient record for us to keep saying that? And I think the answer is no, it doesn't.
Personally, I guess I have concluded there probably weren't golden plates. But it sounds like you haven't made that.
I don't have to make that because it's really irrelevant to what the important thing is. If we had the plates, certainly then we could run a lot of tests on it.
No, it's only relevant to Joseph's credibility, because if there were golden plates, then he wasn't lying. If there weren't golden plates, then how could he have believed there were golden plates if there weren't golden plates? So it is critical to his credibility, isn't it?
I think it is critical that there was some kind of an artifact there, yes. And he's got 11 men who said, yeah, we saw the artifact.
But for you, even, and I think Arrington says this later, there's actually a quote. He says, I pushed him before on certain things and got something of the same answer. I said, okay, Leonard, were there really Nephites and Lamanites? He laughed and eventually said, well, let's put it like this. That is part of the great Mormon myth that we all hold on to and all benefit from. So, I mean, there's a part of him, I think, that was basically saying, even if there weren't plates, even if the book isn't historical, that's not going to get in the way of my finding spiritual or mythical value in the book. And it sounds like you're in that same place.
Yeah.
Even if Joseph deceived people and there really weren't golden plates, you still can view the Book of Mormon text as as scripture and as something that can provide spiritual sustenance even as a mythical document.
Yes, and having looked fairly closely at the Book of Abraham, which I think is our best analogy, I don't see that he was actively deceiving people when he took them into the Nauvoo house and said, here are the manuscripts that were written by Abraham. See, there's his signature. I think that's what he thought. I don't think it's defensible in terms of being an actual historical document. And in fact, the people who have looked at those say, if that were the case, they're off by more than 1,000 years. It just doesn't hold up as what he said it was. But I think there's still a difference between him just fabricating everything or him really playing that role and believing in his own heart, yeah, this is the old stuff and I alone can translate it because I have this gift. Now, in terms of the output, we don't put nearly the value into the Book of Abraham that we do in the Book of Mormon. And it has shown itself not to be very significant either within our canon or within our culture. You don't have people bearing witness to the divinity of the Book of Abraham. It just doesn't reach them on that level. But the Book of Mormon does.
Right. Right. So Scott's asking what book I'm reading from. Scott, you must have joined us late. We're reading from Greg Prince's Leonard Arrington and the Writing of Mormon History, which is the main reason that we're all here today to celebrate this book. One of the really, for me, most jolting parts of this book, Greg Prince, is found on 132 and 133, where Leonard Arrington lists out, I don't know, problems with the church? What would you describe this list as?
Yes.
Yeah, his
Read
problems
'em.
with the church. So we've had people ask us to actually go through these and read them. So I'm going to read some. And then, I don't know, do we want to comment on each one or what do we want to do? We'll see.
We'll see.
We'll just, we'll do some jazz, as Spencer Fluman likes to say. So number one, Leonard Arrington does not like the imposition of one pattern for everybody rather than suggesting 2 or 3 patterns and letting local wards or stakes or districts follow the one most convenient for them. Examples, the 3-hour meeting schedule on Sunday. So he didn't like the 3-hour block, maybe, or felt like...
And this isn't a sign of the true church. This is a sign of any church. There's an interesting article in today's New York Times about the Roman Catholic Church and about the current effort by Pope Francis to decentralize it so that different areas of the world can interpret Roman Catholicism in a way that best suits their own culture. So right on, Leonard.
You're a big fan of that. So that's sort of a negative artifact of correlation, trying to make it like McDonald's, where a Big Mac tastes the same in China as in the United States.
It was a more diverse church then, and in fact, the church that we grew up in was really the embodiment of all of these grassroots initiatives that worked so well that they were centralized and then homogenized. But in the earlier years, there was a tremendous amount of diversity from one area to another.
Yeah. Number 2, appointing the highest tithe payers to positions of leadership rather than the most capable or worthy. In choosing stake leaders, the general authority comes with the list of the 15 or 20 highest tithe payers and starts down the list to choose a stake president and high council. I noticed this growing up in Houston. All the bishops and stake presidents had Mercedes-Benzes and BMWs and Cadillacs. And he's basically validating that was their approach.
So they got those before they became bishops.
They did, yeah, they did. Hopefully. So money tied to leadership.
Well, look at the profiles, not just at the local level, but even at the general level. It's heavily stacked with some demographics and almost devoid of others.
Yeah.
That you have a lot of successful businessmen in there. And I think that was Leonard's point, that at the local level as well, you tend to see overrepresentation in certain classes and either underrepresentation or total absence in others.
Yeah. Number 3, Leonard Arrington's complaints about the LDS Church. The maintenance of a disloyalty file on liberals, including articles they've written with questionable statements, newspaper clippings. These are used against the person without him or her knowing what is in the file and having a chance to deny it or explain it. The supposition is that liberals are out to destroy or embarrass the church, a supposition entirely false. And I had this happen to myself. The good people at the Maxwell Institute and at FAIR gathered information on me and then submitted it. And I think this is the type of thing that Daniel Peterson, Louis Midgley, Greg Smith, and that ilk basically has been doing for decades, and they're still doing it.
So how large is my file?
I don't know. Do you have a file?
I don't know.
But that's the strengthening of the members committee, right? Is that basically what he's talking about there?
Yeah. Now, it's interesting on the timing of that because I think that predated when Gene England blew the cover on that at a Sunstone symposium. So it's possible that was a predecessor to it. I don't know.
Yeah.
But the idea that they were keeping files on people that they viewed with suspicion apparently is a fairly long-standing practice.
And as I remember reading correctly, when Leonard contemplated releasing his own biography, Midgley and others were ready to attack him, and he was worried about the file that might be kept on him. Is that true or not?
Well, he was deeply concerned when he wrote his autobiography that he might be excommunicated for it. You have to view that in the context of what happened 5 years earlier, the September 6th, and I think we'll talk about that later.
We will.
But he knew a lot of those people and knew some of them very closely, and it really unhinged him when they were disciplined, and when he came to write his own autobiography, he was genuinely concerned that that might be the outcome.
Number 4, the insistence on unanimity among the 12, which means that the most obstinate member, the one holding out against the rest, wins. And we've heard this, and I learned this first from Michael Quinn, that if you have to have all 15 unanimously agreeing on anything, what does that do to decision-making in the church?
Yes, now there would be two sides to that coin. Since you do require unanimity, then even a junior guy, if he wanted to veto something, can veto it. The junior guy is not likely to be able to go to the other side of the coin and push something through because he's too junior. That takes both the persistence and the seniority to do it.
But wouldn't you say some of the problems with modern Mormonism is, well, I guess there's probably good and bad to that policy, honestly. It probably keeps them from moving too fast and making some awful mistakes, but it can also make them move very slow so that we can have, 2 or 3 decade late responses to things like the civil rights movement.
And no governing structure is going to be perfect, but in the current environment, it's just possible that there might not be unanimity on some issues, and that is saving us from making some bad decisions.
But how did the November policy get through without unanimity?
I didn't say that.
I'm just saying, how did that happen? I know you hear that everywhere, that there wasn't unanimity with Prop 8 or the November policy. But if unanimity is required, how did those things get through?
Because there are two ways of doing it. One is you take something through the quorum. The other is you go directly to the church president.
So the quorum was bypassed, possibly.
Quorum was bypassed.
For the November policy?
Yes.
And Prop 8?
No, I don't think that the quorum was bypassed on Prop 8. I think what happened was, at all levels, they misestimated what the outcome would be. And I think, perhaps with good reason, that they missed that. And that is that when they jumped into the public square on marriage equality in Hawaii in the early 1990s, they and the Roman Catholic Church had a very functional coalition in Hawaii that worked well. That even when the courts ruled against the church's wishes and struck down the Hawaii laws that had forbidden same-sex marriage, the church was a potent factor in influencing both the legislature to pass a constitutional amendment and in getting the electorate to approve that. They repeated a similar scenario in Alaska just a couple of years after that, then went big time in California in 2000 with Proposition 22. In all of those cases, they were a major, if not a decisive factor in the outcome that they wanted, but there was no blowback. And the reason largely was that the sentiment of the majority of the public was still against same-sex marriage. That had started to shift between 2000 with Proposition 22 and 2008 with Proposition 8, and they didn't factor that into their thinking. So even though they got the same outcome in Prop 8 that they had with the earlier ones in California, Alaska, Hawaii, and other places, the blowback afterwards was immediate, it was drastic, and it was durable. And it caught them totally off guard.
Which might explain why whoever, the word is that Nelson was the one who ramrodded the November 2015 policy through by going directly to the first presidency, it would make sense that he had to do that if other apostles had been impacted by that blowback and didn't want to see something like that happen again.
I think that's the likely scenario. Whereas if you go back to Prop 8, there was buy-in from the 12, but it was in the absence of anybody saying, you know, if we do this, this is what might happen to us.
I had someone very close to this source say that I, John DeLynn, heard about the November policy before Jeffrey R. Holland did. Is that possible? That basically some of the prophets learned about the November policy after it was leaked?
I have heard that he was not in town when it was presented as a done deal to the quorum, which was 2 days before it went public. So I think not only is it possible, it sounds like that was the fact.
Yeah. So at least Holland, we can't blame him for that.
Nope.
Whether or not he would have agreed to it, we don't know. But do we know if any others were out of town?
I don't know.
Okay. All right. Well, this is fun. Number 5, Leonard Arrington on what he didn't like about the church. The insistence on choosing a new president from the senior member of the 12. This means that we'll always have a president far beyond his energetic, creative period of life. We should retire persons from the 12 at age 75 and never choose anyone over that age to be president of the church. You've written on this gerontocracy problem. This is something you've discussed elsewhere.
We said 75 also, but we didn't reference Leonard. It was interesting. He came to the same conclusion independently.
Great minds, Greg Prince. Yeah, I think, man, would it be a different church if we retired the apostles at 75.
Well, what we had proposed as one way of responding to gerontocracy in the article that you referenced was that you establish a mandatory emeritus status at whatever age, and 75 seems reasonable. That would be for the quorum of the 12. So if you haven't become the church president by then, you're released with a vote of thanks and you become an elder statesman, which is fine.
But shouldn't the president have an emeritus too?
That's also what we proposed.
Okay. Yeah.
And maybe it's 80, but also with the caveat that there be a dignified process for a medical emeritus status, even for the church president. So if he starts to lose his fastball, it's possible to have a changing of the guard without anybody losing face.
That'd be wonderful. Pay attention to Greg Prince, church leaders, and Leonard Arrington. Number 6, the first presidency in 12 should call a person in to talk with him, her, before putting the person on the blacklist, not to be cited, his, her books not to be sold in church bookstores, not to be allowed to speak in church, etc. So the blacklist.
I would say it's turtles all the way down on that one.
What do you mean?
Meaning it's not just at the general level. This is abused at the local level too. You've experienced it. I have experienced it on multiple occasions.
You've been blacklisted?
Sure. And in no instance did a local church leader come to me and say, hey, let's discuss this. And yet the good book says that that's what should be done. If someone offend thee, go to that person. And we don't do that.
Good book.
Shame on us.
Good book, good book. No, I'm kidding. I like that. Number 7, the church should allow historians to present human material in biographies of presidents and general authorities. I assume that's not being done?
It's being done now. At least it's been done
By
in a couple
you.
of cases.
Right. But
and
historically...
Richard did it the same year that the McKay book came out with Rough Stone Rolling. I think he probably, from what I understand, got some blowback on that. I never did on David O. McKay, or any of my books for that matter.
Yeah, because Joseph's extra sacred.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've had a lot of compliments on the McKay book just for saying thank you for your honesty. One of them came from a daughter of Ernest Wilkinson. You know that I didn't treat Ernest with silk gloves in that book, but I tried to be balanced. She came up to me after a talk that I gave at a Sunstone Symposium shortly after the book came out, and she said, "I'm Alice Wilkinson Anderson. I read your book, but I read the chapter on my father first, chapter on education." And she said, "Thank you, because you were fair to my father, and other authors have not been." So I will take that pose anytime, that telling the truth, but being balanced in the way that you're telling it, is the formula that you want to have. Just doing a data dump is not necessarily responsible history.
I read a biography of Martin Luther King Jr. once that said when we turn our historical figures into superheroes, we do them and us a disservice. We do them a disservice because if they're superheroes, then what they did wasn't that special. And it does us a disservice because if we think that they had superpowers, then we don't realize what our potential is because we think, well, I can't do what they did because they were superhuman. So you do everyone a disservice by idolizing past leaders.
Yeah.
Them and us.
Yeah. Now, you don't need to dwell on dirt, but you can't pretend that it's not there either.
Yeah.
If your biography of Joseph Smith focuses just on his extramarital adventures, it's not a balanced treatment of who he was and what he accomplished.
Right.
Particularly now that we're 200 years out and can say, he established something that, regardless of what he might have been personally, has been durable and generally benign. That's no small feat.
It's hard to argue with his influence and impact.
Yeah.
Whatever you want to say about him. Number 8, we should allow women to be associates to the 12 and sit in on their meetings. The Relief Society president should sit in on bishopric meetings. Mothers should be allowed to stand in the circle to bless babies, confirm newly baptized persons as members of the church, just as they now can open and close meetings with prayer. He was a bit of a feminist.
Yes, he was. Now, there are some things we do in the church because there is a scriptural mandate, although in some cases we kind of cherry pick there. For instance, what we call a priesthood office, we may find in the Bible, but there are other things that seem to be of the same species that we decide not to call priesthood offices. And there are other things we do simply by convention. For instance, there's no scriptural mandate that the sacrament has to be passed by somebody holding the priesthood. We assigned that to deacons to give them something to do. We didn't have deacons when the church started. They were spliced in later because of Sidney Rigdon coming into town and bringing that out of the Campbellite tradition. And then we had to find something for them to do. There's no scriptural mandate of which I am aware that says that a counselor to a bishop couldn't be a woman.
That's
or
interesting.
to a stake president.
Right.
We do those things by convention.
Right. Interesting.
And even things that are scriptural are not immutable.
Right. Yeah, obviously. There's all sorts of scripture we either ignore, or do the opposite of. Yeah. All right. Number 9 of Leonard Arrington's list of things he doesn't like about the church. The manuals used in adult Sunday school, priesthood, or Relief Society classes are absolutely hopeless. Using the same gospel doctrine manual every 4th year, the same with priesthood manuals, hopeless. Why can't they assign a skilled and experienced writer to do a new manual every year?
They used
like
to.
O.C. Tanner,
They
right?
used to,
Like
yes.
T. Edgar Lyon, like Lowell Benyon. Like
Russell Swenson.
They used to have really smart, engaging people writing manuals, and they stopped.
And people kept the manuals after that year because of that.
Because they were so good.
Yeah. I spoke about Denise Hopkins, who came and taught our study group. When I gave her the Gospel Doctrine Manual, and she had it for a month and came back, I said, "What did you think of it?" And she was trying to be diplomatic, and I said, "Tell me what you really think." And she said, "It's horrible." She said, "This is the worst one I've seen, and I've seen bad ones." So, yeah, right on, Leonard.
Okay, so there's so many cool chapters in this book. I like how when you write a biography, you're not confined to the chronology from start to
I think
finish.
it's boring. That's that may be the order in which you live life, but that's not where the story is.
So tell us how you do structure, because I love how you do it. You did the same thing with him that you did with McKay, right?
Yes, and it's the same thing I did with priesthood. That I went through everything that I felt was remotely related to the subject. In the case of priesthood, I think I went through probably 500,000 pages, mostly in my own library. It included all the church periodicals. Just flip through page by page, and you get to the point where you can scan things pretty quickly and not miss things that might seem even semi-relevant, and they turn out later to be quite important. But then I put everything into the computer verbatim. So for priesthood, I had 10,000 pages of primary source material. For McKay, I think I had 15,000. 7,000 came from his diaries. Once I got everything into the computer, including the transcripts of all the interviews that I had done, and we did 200 for McKay, and I did, I think, about 150 for Arrington. Then I went through line by line and did a cut and paste. Thank heaven for laptops. And built subject files. When I was finished with that process, and in the case of McKay, I think that took me about 2 years. Then I looked at each subject file and asked the question, what's important? For McKay, I think I had 100 subject files and I had 16 chapters. And probably a similar ratio with Leonard. There are some things that might be little nuggets, might be tidbits here and there, but they didn't rise to the level of being a coherent chapter. And that's what I wanted. I wanted each chapter to tell a story so that you could pick any chapter in the book, read it without reading the others, and still come away with a pretty good idea of that subject. And that's what I've done all along, and I think it worked well, because you don't have to bounce back and forth among subjects as you're following the timeline.
So an example of that would be the chapter on Mark Hofmann, which I found to be really interesting and valuable.
Yeah, now that's going to be a fairly compressed timeline for that one,
right?
Whereas others spread out over Leonard's entire life.
And, this is another area where, I tend to over-idolize people myself, and I think I've done that with Lowell Bennion and Leonard Arrington some, but I wasn't super impressed with how he responded to Mark Hofmann's forgeries. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, he missed. And really, everybody in the historical department missed on that.
To give a little bit of background for those.
Background on that is Mark Hofmann emerged on the scene in the late 70s as having discovered, through means that he was a little bit ambiguous about. Later he claimed, well, I went to stamp dealers and looked for postmarks and found things from Palmyra or whatever. But he produced documents that sensationalized Mormon history, that went to the earliest days of Mormonism. It turned out that all of these were forgeries, but he was a very clever guy in the way that he did it, and clever enough that he fooled the church historians. Now, by the time he really hit his stride and it became headed towards self-destruction, where he killed 2 people and then almost blew himself up with another bomb, the history division had been dismantled and sent south. But nonetheless, they did a little bit of consultation with them, and Leonard still bought the whole thing. Even after Hofmann confessed that he had forged these things, Leonard thought, there's still some of them that just sound authentic. And
he still liked the salamander letter.
That was his whole shtick,
right?
That Hofmann had read deeply enough into church history that the documents that he forged sounded like what people already knew from other sources, but added some value. One of the ironies on this is that perhaps the person who would have had most to gain by them not having been forgeries was the one who blew the whistle of them being forgeries, and that was Gerald Tanner.
Yeah, Yeah, we interviewed Sandra Tanner years ago, and she told that story. And
It's an amazing story. She didn't believe Gerald.
right, yeah,
but he was right.
I don't know how. Yeah, so number one, I guess I can't expect Arrington to detect a forgery, but he just bought it hook, line, and sinker, which was interesting.
As did the church authorities all the way to the top.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it's really clear, and people know this, but maybe some of you don't, that the church, what were they doing when they would find out that these documents existed?
Well, these documents always had an edge to them, and that was part of his cleverness.
So the Anthon manuscript he claimed to produce, which was what? The letter relating to the Anthon manuscript.
Right, and his most explosive one was the Salamander letter.
Right.
Where it purports to be the story of a white salamander that transforms itself into the angel giving him the plates.
And he also produces a letter purportedly, stating that Joseph Smith gave a blessing to his son, Joseph Smith III, telling Joseph Smith III that he would succeed him as prophet.
Now, all of these things had some tie-in to known history. The idea of salamanders and folk magic goes way back. The notion that Joseph had ordained, set apart, whatever nomenclature you want, his son to be his successor was the very basis of the formation of the reorganized church. But they didn't have the transcript of the blessing. So he was providing content that related to what people either knew or thought they knew, and so it had the ring of authenticity to it. He also had studied ink and studied what kinds of ink and how to produce an ink that would pass muster as being something antique. He went through the Niles National Register. Are you familiar with that? Niles Register started in 1818. In a way, it was kind of the Time magazine of its era. It was a weekly publication. But the end papers were blank. And so he would go to the University of Utah library and request volumes of that, and then he had a little piece of string that he would keep in his mouth. And he would quietly lay that string against the binding and be able to tear that piece out without causing any noise. They didn't figure this out until later. When they went back, they had all the call slips that he had used a pseudonym for, and then examined each of those, and the front and the back end papers of all of them, they could see had been torn this way. So he was using paper that hadn't been aged. It was old paper. It was from the same time of the events that his forgeries were purporting to portray. But all of this completely escaped the church leaders and the historians.
And according to the book, it was Gordon B. Hinckley who was sort of trying to buy up these documents so that they could be stored in the vault so that they would never see the light of day.
It was buy and hide. And in a remarkable statement that nobody paid much attention to at the time, that really jolted me, Hinckley, who at that time was a counselor in the First Presidency, said, "We have purchased," I think his exact words were, "some 40-odd documents from Mr. Hofmann." And at the time, the historians knew about maybe 3 or 4. So this had been going on for quite some time. Hofmann was really clever in producing documents that could be sold to people who had an interest in hiding the documents. So what would be a better client for a forger than somebody who did not want them to be subjected to scientific examination?
Yeah. Yep. So we can be disappointed that the church was trying to buy and hide, and we can also be disappointed that their gift of inspiration was not plugged in, because they could have, number one, saved a lot of tithing money, but number two, spared a couple of people who ended up dying from this fraud. So it's disappointing. And Leonard just didn't see it.
I think what he saw was that those documents would have allowed the historians to solve a lot of puzzles that otherwise they had not been able to solve.
Yeah.
And he really wanted those answers, and that's why I think he put the blinders on and refused to consider that they were forgeries.
And we all have blinders, so we don't want to get on too high of a horse.